You're listening to the I Love You Keep Going podcast with George Haas. For more information, please visit our website at www.mettagroup.org. That's www.mettagroup.org.
So welcome, everybody. This is I Love You Keep Going. It is March 28th, 2024, 7:35 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. And I thought that I would talk about my own process in finding attachment and how I went about trying to get it repaired. Maybe a few of the things that led up to needing to repair it in the first place. I get a lot of questions about this. In some sense, where we are in our culture is attached. The wave of attachment is about to break. It's just getting out there enough. And Bowlby presented this in the mid '80s as a theory, and in our culture, it takes about 30 years for an idea to move from these small pockets of discovery to a general understanding of it. There's the social science perspective, and then there's also the attachment research oriented points of view on it, so that you'll hear the distinction in the culture as it unfolds as attachment styles and attachment strategies. We tend to be on the attachment strategy side. I like to verifiable things. And I actually think that that's comes from the culture of homophobia that I grew up in, where it was so easy to discriminate against me if there wasn't something tangible that I could point to. So in terms of jobs or things like that, I really needed to have numbers that I could point to so that I wasn't just bashed around by the way things unfold. And how did I even know that I needed to consider attachment, and how did that even enter into my consciousness? I had a difficult childhood. A lot of things went wrong. I had a mother who was an addict. I had a father who was the physician who prescribed the drugs that my mother was addicted to. They both were alcoholics. I grew up in an Irish family where pretty much everybody was an alcoholic, so it seemed pretty normal. It was not even hidden to add a little bit of something to your morning coffee to get the ball rolling at the beginning of the day. I chafed a little bit with one of my uncles because he put vodka in his coffee because he thought nobody could smell it, and I really thought it had to be, bourbon, whiskey. The idea that you would put scotch in coffee was offensive, but not that you would do that was a problem. Everybody did that. It's just how it was. My mother was very volatile. She could be extreme in her responses, sometimes violent, unpredictably. My dad was just sadistic, and he liked to play the long game of humiliating. And he was really skilled at it. So I found myself making a determined stand not to be suckered again, and then I would find myself pulled in and hurt in really terrible ways. So, but it didn't actually occur to me that as I became a daily drinker in the 5th grade, that this was a problem. My parents were often incapacitated by the amount that they drank, and so they taught all their kids how to mix drinks so that we could cover for them in a moment. So I knew how to make a gimlet, and I would make one. The only inquiry was really, are you drinking? No, I'm just having a little bit of Rose's lime juice. So I think that most kids who grow up in these kinds of environments are so heartbroken by the time they get to any kind of place where they could make a decision for themselves, that it isn't toward something, that it's away from the heartache of that we move. Um, One of the other things about those kinds of environments to grow up in is there isn't a lot of this mirroring, this appreciation of who you are and what you could be good at. Uh, and I don't know that it's obvious to us what the consequences of that are. Uh, all the way along, if we had a sensitively attuned caregiver who was interested in the things that we found magical in the world and then encouraged us to explore them and discover them, would have trained us to be good explorers, to know ourselves well, and to know what to pursue, what to do. And when you don't have that in a caregiver, you don't develop the capacity to do that. And so the whole childhood can go by and you really don't ever develop a strong sense of yourself. You don't develop a strong sense of your own preferences. You don't develop the skills to pursue the discovery that would enrich the experience of your life. And then you enter into adolescence. Really, when we're talking about this moment, particularly for people who don't grow up in secure family systems, the way that the mind works changes so that we can begin to reflect on the experiences of our childhood in a way that's much more cognitively oriented and much more sense making. So when you're laying out attachment, you have securely attached and insecurely attached. And then when you look at the insecure side of things, you have organized insecurity and disorganized. And the further you are out into the disorganized end of things, the harder it is to get anything to happen for yourself. This is a puzzling thing, I think, for most kids. Uh, you can evaluate the quality of the people around you and their sensibility and their capabilities, and you can evaluate your own. But it's very hard to make sense of why some kids can make things go okay and some kids can't, particularly if you're one of the kids who can't make things go that well. Um, because the things that need to happen for you to be able to organize your life so that they go well are absent in the family systems and in the environments where you grow up. So you can't just point to them because they're not there to begin with, and you're not trained. And of course, the people that do have security and do have those sensitively attuned caregivers who are nurturing and encouraging, you're in that child situation taking off. And if you don't have that childhood, you're not. So they begin to move ahead, even in childhood. And I noticed in my own experience of conditioning how confusing that was, that some people could move ahead and I didn't seem to be able to manage that. And also, when I noticed who I was able to form social groups with, we also weren't moving ahead so much. So the people were. in that shift in puberty, where really what happens is this child's brain, which is just this whole bunch of unconnected things waiting to grab the experience of life, becomes radically pruned to the barest scaffolding thing of things that are already connected. And this is a separating experience. If it's not already connected, that the ease of connecting it is lost, and then learning becomes much harder. And if you grow up in environments where there's a lot of deprivation, there aren't a lot of connections in comparison to somebody who grows up in a rich environment. And again, you're set back. Um, you have the capacity now to examine whether or not the conditions of your childhood were actually in your interest or not. And if you make the decision that it was that the way that your caregivers took care of you was not in your interest, but in their interest, the epistemic trust breaks. And as a group, we turn away then from all of the adults because the cognitive mind in humans doesn't develop at puberty. It develops over a decade. It really isn't until you're in your mid-20s that you can think clearly about any of this stuff. And that's why that period is so crucial for development. And if you have a sensitive enough family system and they take care of you and they direct you and they discuss with you the different approaches that you might make and what you're good at and what you're interested in and what you might want to find out, you make better choices than if you turn away from the whole adult world and you're just in the group of people that have also turned away all of the adult world, and you make choices based on your cognitive capacity, which is not developed yet, and this leads you in the different directions. I grew up in a family system where suicidality was one of the emotional regulation strategies, and I got quite frightened in my mid-teens that I would end up suiciding, and so I went into therapy. I didn't realize that my parents selected the therapist based on the idea that I could be converted from homosexuality into heterosexuality. So I ended up going into conversion therapy. Uh, it didn't work very well, except that I ended up depriving myself of the sexual encounters in high school that might have been nurturing, because I always said no to them because the rule of conversion therapy is don't sleep with your own sex, sleep with the opposite sex as much as you can. I didn't understand that at the time either. It took reflection from much later. I wasn't so good at making relationships work anyway. I don't know if you have had that sense of wondering how some people can just make these relationships work and you can't. That was one of the great puzzles of my early life. Um, I left home quite early. I started leaving home when I was 17, and when I turned 18, I left. And I lived on the street for 15 months. I don't know if you've ever lived on the street before. I thought of it in my own mind as my great adventure, but actually it was pretty grim when I look at it and reflecting back. It wasn't as grim as being at home. There was that choice. It was better to live on the street than to live at home. And so you might have a sense of what that was like. Um, I had a lot of mental illness when I was younger. The diagnosis that I got in my mid-30s was dissociative identity disorder, and but I didn't know that when I was a kid. I didn't know how dissociative I was. I knew that uh, people reacted to me in ways that I couldn't understand. They would say, "Oh no, George is being crazy again," but I couldn't reflect on what I might have done that would have caused that to happen. And I wasn't really able to track the comings and goings and the losses of time. It had always been like that. That's one of the things that without the capacity to reflect back, you begin to notice. Living on the street is very painful, and so it produced a general increase in the amount of substances I needed to take in order to balance myself. I did make an attempt to try to go to college and to settle things down, but the addiction at that point was so bad that I couldn't really function very well. I got pulled into one of my dad's sadistic games, and the outcome was so humiliating and so painful that I just said, I'm out. I'm out of here. And I left. I dropped out of college and I moved to New York just to get away from it because it was so painful. And in the mid 1970s, and I moved to New York in 1975. It was a bombed out city. If you go to New York City now, it's this completely gentrified and sparkly playground. But in the mid 70s, it was a 40% occupancy of buildings below 14th Street. So that meant all the storefronts were occupied, but none of the upper floors were occupied. And so you could get a cheap place to live. I rented a loft on 11th and Broadway in Manhattan for 1,400 square feet for $174 a month. So you can imagine. So it's all a bunch of people like me, all a bunch of people who have left and fled and come to this place. It's super cheap. We have to work 2 days a week to pay the bills. And the other 5 days of the week, we can gather in our groups and make art and play and try relationships. That was marvelous. My brother killed himself when I was 23 and he was 22. And that sort of flattened everything. You've had experiences like that. It was an accidental death, but it was the third life-threatening accident he'd had in 6 months. And in trying to make sense of that, the drinking got out of hand. And I ended up with cirrhosis of the liver when I was 23. And the doctor said to me, you have a few months to live if you don't stop this, which, caught my attention. Didn't make me stop, which I really couldn't do. I was teaching ceramics at Hunter College in exchange for use of the lab. When I was in Chicago, I was in arts school, and one of the things I did was ceramics. And one of my students suggested that I accompany her to an AA meeting, which was surprising since I'd not really heard of it. And off we went to a meeting in New York, which is still happening, called Amsterdam. And having spent a year of trying to stop and not being able to, suddenly this made total sense to me. And it was a group of people and I could stop. And so I stopped. And actually, I'm one of those people who has been off substances from the first meeting. So it's kind of unusual. And that was in 1978, so quite a long time ago, 45 years or so. And the change just physically from not drinking so much, by then I could drink 1 or 2 days a week and I would just be vomiting sick the other days because of the liver issues. Christian?
George, I'm curious because that does seem pretty unusual if you can make sense of what it was about jumping into that first meeting um that it kind of just stuck from there.
I think that if I hadn't spent a year trying everything I could possibly think of to try and stop, I wouldn't have been able to. But it was uh, that I had someone. I finally had other people that would help me.
Okay. So this kind of social structure.
Well, you could go. I went to a couple of meetings a day, and I went to a couple of meetings a day for a, a year, I think, because that was possible. And there was one meeting in particular, which is actually still there, called Perry Street. I don't know if you've ever been to New York. They had meetings all day long, and it was you can imagine a time in the world where there was one program called AA. None of the other ones had split off yet. There wasn't even NA yet, and there was Al-Anon, and that was it. And so you had a kind of umbrella of people that came in. But I would also say in 1975, Alcoholics Anonymous meant alcohol only, and if you were using a lot of other party drugs, that was totally cool. And so on Sunday or Monday, everybody would come in sort of hungover from being at the discos. It was disco then all weekend. We actually took a stand and we started a meeting, which is also still there, called Completely Sober, where in order to qualify at that meeting, you had to be clean and dry. You couldn't just be dry. And that was quite controversial. For a while, they were unwilling to list us in the meeting guide because we insisted that people not use drugs. I think it's gone the other way at this point. But this is also, I think, something that's important that you're pointing to, Christian, is I think for most of us that come out of these kinds of environments, we want to have a life that's good for us. We want to have a life that works for us. We can't understand why we can't do it when we seem as capable as everybody else to do these things. And it's so frustrating that we can't figure this out because we're so bright, we're so lively, we're so beautiful. I think that's one of the things that is so heartbreaking about this. You see young people, and you see people who have gone through these terrible things and survived them, and they're so beautiful, and at the same time they can't figure out these puzzles. And so we go into different things. I'm maybe 5 years of the program was good. I figured that drugs and alcohol were out, but then it turned out I was also sex addicted. It was also true that I was addicted to risk. It was also true that I was terrible with money. It was this whole set of things that then had to be addressed one by one, which I did. But then I found, and we used to call it the 5 or 6 year slump in the rooms, which is when the depression that had always been there just won't break. And then many of us turned to psychotherapy. And again, there was a big lift from that attention to this and listening to the quality of our thought processes, which was nice to have, and also group therapy so that you could really get into the difficulty of forming relationships and practice and try to make something happen. Um, the difficulty of my life in being a gay man in the 1980s in New York is that AIDS happened. This is it's an unusual experience, which I really hope that you never get close to, because over the course of 4 or 5 years, 80 people that I knew died. And all of the people in my inner circle died. And really, for me, it was the first time I'd ever felt loved, and I'd ever felt that I had an effect in loving other people, and they all died. And it was at that time in our country an extremely hostile environment, no legal protections, really, no help. The government, as I said, probably 14,000 people died before they even mentioned it. Can you imagine that happening to the straight community? And so I ended up in LA at that time, because there was really no care that we could get from the government and no real help. We all made these arrangements with each other that if we got sick and we needed somebody to take care of us at the end, that we would step up and do that. And I had made an arrangement with a friend of mine, John, and he called me and said, "You have to come now." And so I just left New York and went to LA to take care of him. And I was interested in the movie business, and so and I started to work in the movie industry and took care of him, and he died not so long after that. And at about that time, because his death was so difficult, I went back into psychotherapy and was actually properly diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder. Now, I'm in my late 30s at this point. I started therapy when I was 15 and was misdiagnosed the whole way along until I was in my late 30s. Lots of the different things that they offered were counterproductive to people who are dissociative, and it was never understood. This is extremely frustrating in terms of a life. And again, what happens is when you can't step up, and what really happens is not so much that you can't get the job or you can't do the job, it's that you can't make the social relational piece work. And so you keep getting pushed out of these social groups. And as they develop, of course, you have to go back to the beginning, and over again, there's this cycle of beginnings, some middles, you don't finish too much. But also what ends up happening is you don't develop the skill level that then is appropriate with your age. And then it gets harder and harder the more you age. I went into treatment for dissociative disorders and actually made progress with that and was able to resolve the dissociative part. And integration is one of the choices that you have when you get into working with dissociative disorders. And I decided I would integrate and have one timeline rather than have disconnected timelines. And I mapped 80 segments of timeline, which was quite a few. So it made sense that my life was so chaotic. And I actually got to the end of psychotherapy where they said, "You've done amazing work. That you've made this much progress is absolutely incredible. And now what you're going to have to do is adjust to the way that your life is. All of these things have happened to you. They've all had an effect on you. And here you are, really, this is a good outcome." But it didn't feel like a good outcome. And I thought, if this is how it's going to be, why would I even stick around for this? And then, quite by accident, a friend of mine gave me a bootleg CD of a lecture that Alan Shore gave on disorganized attachment. Alan Shore is a researcher, he said, at UCLA. I listened to this CD in my car, and I was stunned. In 10 minutes, the description of the different attachment strategies and the patterns that those lives produce described my life in a way that 25 years of psychotherapy had not managed to crack. And I was so enthused by this that I immediately ran around everywhere I could think of to try and find somebody who would help me. And I was not, I was also used to doing this. When I was in New York, I realized that I had been sexually abused by both parents, and I needed treatment for that. And there wasn't any treatment. And I finally ended up talking to the woman who wrote the manual for the Connecticut State Police Department on how to interview people who have been sexually assaulted. The state of treatment where that was necessary. She recommended 3 places to get treatment in New York City. 2 of them would not allow men in because men were always the perpetrator. Even if you were assaulted when you were 4 years old, if you're the person assaulting you was female and you were the male, you were the perpetrator. It was quite a despairing time. I did find somebody to help me, and so, but in the late 90s in Los Angeles, there was no one working therapeutically with attachment. So you get a sense of how new this approach is. But I was meditating, and when the therapy process ended, I went deeply into my meditation practice because I got some relief from the distress of a truncated life. And I thought that some of these things that come up in the attachment dynamics were trackable through meditation, and that I could figure out a way to improve the condition of my life using meditation and reflecting on attachment as the object of meditation. And so I began to develop that in my private practice. In around that time, I started teaching at Against the Stream, and I was a student of Shinzen Young's, and he requested that his senior students teach, and so I started teaching his stuff. But I couldn't get any traction from anybody with his techniques because the culture of ATS was very different from that. But somebody came up to me and said, you know, you used to be the angriest person I'd ever met, and you're not angry anymore. And I would really like to know how you did that. And so I started teaching a class called Overcoming Anger. And then somebody came up to me and said, you know, anger isn't really my issue. Sadness is my issue. Could you teach a class on sadness? So I started teaching a class called Overcoming Sadness. And then somebody came up to me and said, you know, anger and sadness aren't my issue. Fear is my issue. Could you teach a class on fear? So I started teaching a class on fear, and I'd get 5 or 6 students, something like that. And then somebody came up to me and said, anger, fear, and sadness aren't my issue. Shame is my issue. And so I thought, I'll teach a class on overcoming difficult emotions, since it's all basically the same thing. Then I was getting 15 or 20 people coming to class. And then somebody came up to me and said, you know, it isn't difficult emotions that are the problem. It's the relationships that cause the difficult emotions that are the problem. And then the light bulb went on. Actually, what they're talking about is attachment, the difficulty of attachment conditioning interfering with the capacity to form meaningful relationships, which means you're out on your own. And we're just not, human beings are just not designed for that. It's too painful to feel separated. It's too painful to feel isolated. It's too painful to feel that you can't connect to anybody. So I started teaching a class called The Meaningful Life, which was about attachment. I went up and I studied with Mary Main and Eric Hesse at Berkeley in the Attachment Institute to learn how to give the adult attachment interview, but mainly because I wanted a more scientifically based understanding of the dynamics of attachment so that I could relate this better. And then I decided I would give the adult attachment interview to everybody who took the course. We wouldn't score them, but we would have them as a reference to make sure that what we were doing worked. And so after 4 or 5 years of this, we did the second interview and discovered really that the approach that we had, which was the psychoeducation around attachment and the meditation to develop mentalizing and emotional regulation, wasn't enough to actually shift people's attachment. I had a student at the time say to me, have you ever heard of this guy named Dan Brown? He's not the guy who wrote the Da Vinci Code, but the guy, Daniel P. Brown, who was the researcher at Harvard. And I said I hadn't. And he said, he has a book on it. He sounds like you, and he has a book on attachment. You should read it. So I ordered it, and it came, it was 800 pages. I put it on a shelf. And then a little while later, his partner called and she said, can you imagine an ideal parent figure? And I said in my usual glib way, sure, in a coffin. And she said, not your parents, ideal parents who will take care of you, love you. And I said, and so, well, all right, I'll give that a try. And after about a couple of months, I couldn't imagine ideal parent figures. I had no reference for what that would be. And so I read the book, and he described it. And I thought, oh, this is terrific. I need to have dinner with this guy. And so I spent a couple of months, actually it took about 4 months of wiggling around in the different social networks and try to get an invitation. And one day, out of the blue, I got a call. And he said, "This is Dan Brown. I looked at your website. You're the real thing. We can have dinner." So we made a dinner date in Boston. So I flew to Boston to have dinner with this guy, and we hit it off. And he talked about the first pillar of his 3-pillar system, which was the ideal parent figure protocol, where the visualization of ideal parent figures embedded into the memory creates the possibility of a different kind of reality. So I know that this is a meditation oriented discussion, but you have the capacity to sense the object that can be sensed when there's contact. Consciousness of that sensing experience arises. It's evaluated for urgency. Does it need immediate attention? Does it not matter? Is there time for a pleasant experience? And then that undifferentiated, undefined sensing experience is compared to the perceptual database. And if there's a memory in there, an experience in there that's close enough to that, the whole string of meaning, we hold things in strings. Everything that's similar is held on a single string. That whole string of memory attaches, and it rolls into conceptual reality. And so we can over and over again experience these realities that never let us out of the early conditioning because we're confined to the database. One of the things that happens to people who have adverse childhood experiences, we begin to restrict our capacity to imagine things that are different than what happens, because imagining things that are different is too painful. So we restrict our memory, our imagination, which might be able to solve some of these dilemmas, because we're now not children. We're not confined to the family system. We have more agency, but we still keep creating these realities over and over again that reflect the conditioning. And so in that moment when all of the choices open up, we only see the ones that we're conditioned to see, and we repeat these patterns over and over again. And it's so frustrating when you recognize that that's what's happened again. But in the moment of it happening, you couldn't choose differently. So with this ideal parent figure, what you're doing is you're stacking into that database ideal alternatives to what actually happened to you now. It isn't that we want you to believe in fantasy. We don't. But we do want you to understand that you create the reality that you're experiencing and that you can create a different. And if you create a different one, you just act differently because your experience is different. Have you ever, Christian?
Georgia, this is a little bit of an aside, but I was wondering offhand if you know how far back Dan was actually like doing IPF.
About
Like,
20 years it took.
really? Cool.
Well, if you're into, one of the things you'll notice about attachment is it's extremely resilient. It's transgenerationally resilient. You have an 85% chance of having the same attachment strategy as your primary caregiver. It is really, take that in. It's not your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. In your childhood, when the windows of learning opened up, you learned what your caregiver had to teach you, and you took it in and you learned it and you developed it as a skill for operating. That it was a crap system is a whole different question. But you didn't do anything wrong in learning what was offered to you. You did it right. You did it just how you're supposed to do it. And the good news here, of course, is that this is changeable. You can learn something different. You learned this, you can learn something different that will be better. And it doesn't really take that long. There's always the question of what's long. It's not as fast as a pill, but it lasts longer. I was 65 when I started this work with Dan Brown, having spent an entire lifetime trying everything that was available to see if I could fix this, since I could see how limiting it was. And it took about 2.5 years to move from complexly disorganized to earn secure. Now, mind you, 28 years of psychotherapy with really good people, and my complexly disorganized attachment strategy was completely unfazed by this. And complexly disorganized attachment is a really hard road to live. Turns out that in addiction, 70% of complexly disorganized people are addicts. It's the most common outcome for disorganized people is addiction. 30% of dismissing people are addicts, but 70% of disorganized people are addicts. So that's the place to begin to look. And it's a hard way to go. But with these, I like to call them dopey meditations, where you're just visualizing ideal parent figures taking care of you and loving you and thinking you're terrific and delighting in you, can change the way that you experience everything. And in changing the way that you experience everything, choosing differently, it repairs the imagination so that you can see in each of the moments that are arising all of the choices, not just the ones that you've habitually chosen. And you can choose differently and then begin to have these different experiences. And it isn't cognitive, and it isn't the self that's doing this, to talk about it in more in meditation terms. The self is really the witness to what you choose, and you see yourself choosing differently, and it's quite remarkable. And it then also leads to these deeper insights about the nature of reality and how you make it up. If you've always made reality in one way, and then all of a sudden you're just making it in another way, you have this deep insight into the nature of how you experience things. And then, of course, you have this progress that happens. So you're doing a visualization, you're developing meditation experiences that are emotionally regulating and mentalizing, developing your capacity to mentalize. You have a psychoeducation around how secure relationships are supposed to function. If you don't grow up in a secure environment, you don't know how relationships are supposed to function. You know how they function in your family system, and you know how they function in the person that you partner with. But if neither one of you has an idea of how secure relationships are going to function, you need an education around what that's supposed to be like. Otherwise, they're so painful to be in, and they're so limiting in terms of your exploration in life. It is very ordinary for people to get into their mid 30s or so and just stop, give up on trying, because it's so disappointing to try again and then not be able to figure it out. And it's so disruptive to other things that you might want to do. We do see this giving up that happens in sort of the mid to late 30s about trying to make this stuff work, and then we just go it alone, solo. So you have these meditations, and you imagine the world in a way that's responsive to you and supportive of you, and that you can actually succeed in the things that you need. Then you make a reality that that's how it is, and then you begin to develop uh, actions in the world that support that. And you move from these visualizations to these actual experiences where that's happening. So there's this exponential growth in terms of the usability of these admittedly rickety visualizations in the beginning that then become these experiences that you actually have. As that changes, the whole nature of your life changes. So I would recommend you do it sooner than later, because I can tell you doing it at 65, it's totally worth doing, but I really wish I'd done it at 15 when I first tried to figure out what was going on, because that whole part of my life that went to the disorganization, it's already lost. Lacey?
Yeah, hi. I'm wondering, so when I hear you speak about you healing your attachment system and it taking about 2.5 years, I've been familiar with this story for a while and thought to myself, I've got Dan P. Brown's book, I've, show up to some of your classes. But where I find the difficulty is actually being able to like be present enough to do the practices as as regularly as they're needed. And I wonder if I have the label of ADHD, also extreme attachment disruption from infancy to about 8 years old in about 20 different foster homes. So
Oh, yeah.
because of that, I think that's part of why I have difficulty creating that regularity of routine. And I'm just wondering if you have advice for those of us that because of our attachment system or whatever we dealt with in our younger years, have so much difficulty actually implementing these practices in the way that leads to this success. And, wondering
Well,
if
what
you,
I would recommend you do is go along with the way that we've set it up.
yeah,
So level one is the first piece. It's condensed and happens over 4 days. And then go into the level two, which is over 6 months.
yeah,
And then you need to move into the one-on-one facilitated ideal parent figure sessions.
I think that's probably right.
And then it's also useful to get an assessment at some point so that there's an understanding of what your attachment conditioning is.
Mm-hmm.
There's 3 different assessments that we use. One is the adult attachment interview, which covers 0 to 3. Then there's the schema inventory, which covers the mid-childhood period. And then there's the CCRT or ERT, depending and which one you use, which analyzes the adult relationships that you have,
I see.
so that you know what to do in order to change it. The interventions are not, it's not a single intervention. It really is an intervention dependent on what your attachment conditioning is.
Okay. Yeah.
That's what I would recommend. But Dan's research showed it was between 40 and 150 sessions that it took to change it. But the system itself is very reliable. We know from around here, having participated in a study with Dan, that the two-pillar approach that we used did not have much effect on attachment, but adding the ideal parent figure did. So it's fairly reliable in that way. You just have to complete it.
Yeah.
We do notice that the one group that has a hard time with that is fearfully preoccupied people have a hard time finishing things. But the other attachment strategies are usually effective in going through. And the things being as unfair as they always are, dismissing people, that fixes fast and easy, and organize people faster, and then disorganize people are harder.
Right.
The attachment, the attention piece is more basic meditation training to overcome that, to develop enough concentration to do it. But I think what's coming out about that, of course, is that it's a normal adaptation that benefited hunter-gatherers, and that the reason why we have a difficulty with it is because our education system doesn't accommodate it, not that it's actually a problem.
Right.
So I think that there's going to be a reorientation around that. So
makes
that
sense.
use it as an asset rather than think of it as a deficit in terms of how to progress.
Lacey, I don't know if you'll find this helpful, but for me, I found it really helpful to have people to like practice and talk about this with. So like
Yeah.
for me, it was people I met in the level 2 class, and we still, that was years ago, and we still get together and meditate together and chat. So I found that helpful to kind of have a structure, people to kind of meet on a regular basis.
Yes.
Um,
I appreciate that. I'm actually in level 2. I didn't do level 1 because I was like, I know so much about this stuff already that like I should go into level 2. But I am in level 2, but I'm recognizing that maybe level 1 actually provides some of the continuity that would be more useful. And perhaps I can reach out to people in the cohorts or whatever you call it to see if they'd want to get together. Because I agree that having others is helpful, and I might be more fearful preoccupied, so that's kind of frustrating.
Yeah, I always say, are you somebody who likes to jump into the deep end, or are you somebody who needs to inch into the shallow end of the pool? And disorganized people jump into the deep end. That's what we do. No caution, no expectation. Well, we probably don't expect it to go well anyway, so who cares, right?
Yeah. So the level 2 though, do you find there's not as much, there's more support than in level 1, or more support to actually do the meditations together, or?
There's more continuity in terms of the time frame, and so if you're, we offer in these classes what I call always cool, always kind, which is 90 hours of meditation instruction that's recorded. And so there's 20 hours of basic meditation, and then 84 meditations, which are for mentalizing and emotional regulation, and then 56 meditations that are for developing positivity. And just go through from the beginning all the way through. That should take you.
Yeah.
And then if you're in the level 2 class and you're sitting daily with all of this stuff, you can then ask your questions about the techniques as the class goes on to develop them.
Thank you.
That was a lot of blabbing. What do you say we do a little meditation? I'm going to offer just a basic see, hear, feel practice, which is a vipassana or insight practice. So go ahead and take your meditation posture. All right, let go of the meditation. Any comments or questions about that? We have a level 1 series that's starting on the first week of April for 4 Saturdays. So from 9 until 1. Take a look at that if you're interested in it. It gives an overview of the whole attachment idea and links it to the different meditation practices. We'll talk about also how relationships are supposed to function. I'm going to go away for 5 weeks and teach a retreat in Poland for a couple of weeks. If you want to come to Poland, please do. And then also I'm going to teach a week in Utrecht, which is in the Netherlands. And then I'll come back. So we will miss those days here, but we'll let people know. And then when I get back, we're going to do a series of meditation and addictions, level 1s. And I'm also going to offer meditation and addiction level 2, which I haven't done outside of rehabs. And that's a 12-week class that meets 3 times a week. Chris?
I have a question about the format, the 4
Okay.
hours. Can you give me a little idea about that?
Sure. It's a 2-hour class, and then a 15-minute break, and then an hour and 45-minute class.
Okay.
Each class is going to have meditation instruction and maybe an hour of didactic, and then Q&A. So in the first part of the class is talking about mentalization and emotional regulation using meditation as a way of organizing that. And then we'll move into organized descriptions of organized attachment and then descriptions of disorganized attachment. So a general setting in an introduction, then talking about mentalizing, emotional regulation, and then secure functioning, dismissing functioning, preoccupied functioning, and then disorganized functioning. So fearfully preoccupied, fearfully avoidant, and then complexly disorganized. And then the last piece is going to be about what do you do about it, and an introduction of the ideal parent figure protocol.
Thank you.
So think of it this way. It's skipping a stone across the pond is level 1. And then when the stone sinks, that's level 2. Level 2 is much more granular and much more detailed about it. So sometimes it's harder to get the overview of it. And then there isn't much in the way of ideal parent figure protocol training in level 1, whereas level 2 has a lot of it. We expect you to come out of level 2 ready to go for your individual facilitation, rather than spending a few months developing your capacity to do that within the facilitation. So it's more economical. Plus, there's a normalizing feature about it. Everybody, it has unique conditioning. We're all different from each other, and we all make up reality different from each other. And so we all make up ideal parent figures differently. And it can be very liberating to have a dialogue with other people about what they're doing in that way, so that you don't feel like because you have to have a crow and a tree as your ideal parents. You're an oddball. And I know for me, it took about 2.5 months to figure out an ideal father figure, because I had so little reference that I could use. My mother was a little bit easier, the ideal mother figure, because my mother was a hapless abuser rather than sadistic abuser. So. Plus, everybody learns at their own speed, and one of the things that makes the accommodation for that is everything is repeated over and over again. So you don't have to grasp all of it at once. You can just let it sort of percolate in. And really, we need it to be relatable to our experience, not an overview. And so one of the things about it, the style of teaching is what I would call a Socratic method, which is driven by the questions that people ask rather than by an outline. I know some people prefer an outline or that kind of way of learning, and this is not that. But also the reason for that is that insecure and disorganized people, it's so specific that you want to be free to really get the information that you need rather than just a syllabus worth of information. There's way more information about this than we could cover in level 1, and so that's why it's a little bit lighter. And then the level 2 is more granular, where you really can go deeply into the things that affect you. I think that's important to understand. You can come and we can answer questions about you, and you don't have to be accommodating to the whole class. But everybody in the class can do that. So you have to be accommodating in terms of listening to everybody's specific questions about themselves. You know how we are. We'll ask, I'm asking for a friend. When actually you're asking for yourself, right? So we endorse that because that's how we learn. And because everyone is unique, you can't use a generic answer anyway. It doesn't help. How's that?
That's great. Thank you.
Christian?
George, when you're in Poland, you need to go to the Gdańsk shipyard, which is famously where Lech Wałęsa built single-handed. Yeah, he built the world's largest submarine with the screen door.
You know who Lech Wałęsa is? He was the person who helped organize the unions that then broke the communist government. And he was very my favorite quote of his was, "They pretend to pay us and we pretend to work."
I took that motto. Bureaucrats.
All right. What else is happening? I think that's about it for this half of the year. I'm gonna try and do some other retreats, maybe in Nashville and maybe up in Oakland in the second half of the year. But take a look at that. We have a new website, which is we're in the process of unrolling, and I think it's pretty lacy. Do you have your hand up?
Yeah, I just saw your new website. Actually, I was quite impressed.
Oh, thank you.
Very pretty. It's pretty. Yeah. Just a quick question about those 3 tests that you had mentioned for, I know one of them was the to learn your attachment style, but you had 3 that you'd mentioned. I'm curious if you could tell me the price for all 3 of them together.
We don't actually charge anything for the schema inventory, and we don't charge anything for the CCRT. The schema inventory is a 232 questions or statements that you relate to on a it's at a Liger scale anyway. And then it only takes us about 15 minutes to score it, so it just is part of the process. The CCRT is quite a complex thing, and so the way that we work with it is it's a inventory of your relationships, so that to see if we can identify patterns in relationship. And so we tend to do that in relationship to individual IPF sessions. So you'll do a history of the relationship, and then we'll review that, and then we'll do an IPF session on the relationship pattern that emerges from.
So should I just email you guys to kind of set something like that up?
Yeah, totally.
Okay. Great. And I don't know if you saw my message, but if you ever want to come to a retreat on Vancouver Island, Canada, BC.
Is there a place to do a retreat there?
A lot, and I'm quite connected here, so it would be really cool.
I'm happy to come. So let's work it out.
Okay, great.
All right. Yes.
Sorry, I don't know how to raise the hand thing.
Okay.
My name is Kyle. I was wondering, what are you doing in Nashville and when?
I don't know yet. There's a place called Wild Heart there, and they've invited me to come, and we'll work out the dates.
Okay, gotcha.
Do you know Wild Heart Meditation Center?
I don't. Is it in Nashville or is it in like Brentwood or?
It's in Nashville. So
It's in Nashville. Okay, gotcha. Thank you very much.
somebody told me the nickname for Nashville was Nasty. Is that right? No comment. Huh?
I don't know. I don't know. I know it's the bachelorette capital of the world. So yeah.
Right. All right. I offer the teaching freely, but if you're resourced and you can make a donation, it's appreciated. There's a link on the website to do that. It helps support me and also the work that Mettagroup is doing. Really appreciate your practice. Thank you for coming. We'll see you soon, I hope. Bye.